What is the best prime lens for wildlife photography? Do you even need a prime lens? Hey there, my name is Siler Peralta Ramos, and I'm a professional wildlife photographer based in Jackson, Wyoming. Today, I have a really special lens here that I'm going to be talking about. This is kind of my bread and butter lens for wildlife photography. This is a Canon 600mm f4 lens RF version. This is my brand new lens that I got about 5 weeks ago. So I've had about 5 weeks of the spring to really put this lens through its paces, get a sense for what photographing with a 600mm f4 is like. There's a big sort of constant debate in the world of wildlife photography as to what the best prime lens is. And everyone has to make their own individual choice in regards to that. Typically, I see a lot of photographers choosing between a 600 f4, 500 f4, or 400mm 2.8. And having just sold my 400mm 2.8, I have a pretty good idea of the differences between these two lenses. The thing that really is enticing about a 400 2.8 lens is the use of extenders. Oftentimes in wildlife, 400 millimeters just isn't close enough unless you're doing kind of some wider environmental shots, which typically I find, when I'm doing those wider environmental shots, I use this 100 to 500 because sometimes I want to be more zoomed out than 400 millimeters even. And I like having that flexibility to do that. And so the 400 is really an enticing lens with those teleconverters. And when I had the 400mm 2.8, I was using it almost exclusively with a 1.4 teleconverter. On Lightroom, you can see how much you shot with a certain lens in a certain configuration. And it was about 95% of the time that I used that teleconverter on there. And the vast majority of kind of usable shots that I liked from that lens were shot at that 1.4 extension. And so I was essentially shooting at 600 millimeters f4 on my 400mm 2.8. On the occasional times that I would photograph with the 400 2.8 without a teleconverter on, I was blown away by how much sharper the image was and how much faster the camera focused on the subject. And it became frustrating to me that I always had to have this 1.4 extender on there in order to get the amount of magnification that I needed for a lot of the wildlife subjects that I was photographing. And so over the last about 2 years, I've been debating making the switch over to a 600mm f4 for that very reason. I just felt like, if I'm going to use an extender, I'm probably going to, only want to use a 1.4. And beyond that, I don't want to have to use an extender the majority of the time. And so I decided that I was going to sell my 400 2.8 and buy a 600mm f4. So I want to show a quick example here in Adobe Lightroom. This is an image made on the 400mm f2.8 lens from earlier this spring, and this is a photograph of grizzly bear 610. This was a roadside situation, and so the rangers were there, and this was as close as we could possibly be allowed to be to grizzly bear 610 here. And this is the full frame shot at 400 millimeters. And while I do like having some of the mountains here in the background, The bear is pretty small in the frame, particularly, if you're going to be sharing this on social media where you're looking at this image at a really small size. That background just isn't quite interesting enough, and it's kind of taking away from the bear. And so the image that I'd much more prefer in this situation is something a little bit tighter like this, which is what I would have been able to get with the 600. And I can crop the image from that 400. It's sharp enough to get enough detail here to do this kind of crop. But again, in a world where I'd ideally like to crop as little as possible, I'd much rather be able to take this shot. And then if I want a more environmental shot like this, I can take that with the 100 to 500 lens as well. So that's a quick example there. And let me show you one more. So this is an image that I shot on the RF 600 millimeter f4. And this is of coyote pups that I photographed this spring. And they were playing around, and they were not too bothered by my presence. I was pretty far back from them. And so the full frame shot that I got from this lens was actually this. And so this is a pretty big crop to go from that to this. And let's say I had been on the 400 millimeter without the teleconverter, it would have been an even more severe crop to the extent that this would just not have really been a usable image at all. And then beyond that, had I used the 1.4 teleconverter, I just wouldn't have had the kind of sharpness that is still in this image after that kind of a crop. Partly that's a factor of the 45 megapixel sensor on the Canon R5, but also I have a lot more leeway to create a usable image in this kind of situation where, had I been closer to these coyote pups, I wouldn't have been able to get this kind of interaction between these two pups. And so this was an image that was made possible by the 600 millimeter. Would it have been nice to have a 1.4 teleconverter on the 600 millimeter? Yes, absolutely. That would have made this shot even better. And in order to get that kind of focal length on the 400, I would have had to use the 2x extender, which I've just never gotten usable results out of. A lot of times it can be nice to be able to get closer to your subject, but I am as close to my subjects as I feel ethically comfortable with and feel legally comfortable with. Here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, you're supposed to be about 100 yards from grizzly bears or wolves, and then about 25 yards from any other wildlife. There are also a lot of situations where, I might not be in the park where there are regulations or things like that about being close to wildlife, but I want to experience the natural behaviors of wildlife and photograph wildlife in its natural form and not photograph wildlife that's just responding to me as a photographer. That was a difficult decision because as wildlife photographers, we love being close to wildlife, but I ultimately, I don't want to do photography in a way that is going to make me feel the need to be closer and closer to an animal. And so it just really felt like the right decision for me to move to a 600. This particular lens, the RF 600, costs about $13,000. That's pretty par for the course. I think the Sony version of the 600 f4 is also right there around $13,000. And then the Nikon is a little bit more because it has a built-in teleconverter. The point is, these are very expensive lenses. And so you definitely don't want to buy one of these lenses without knowing that you're going to use it and that you're going to potentially make money with it. For me, as a professional photographer, this is a lens that I'm going to have for, probably 10 years or more, depending on sort of how technology progresses. Lens technology progresses much slower than other technology. And so a $13,000 lens like this is probably, if I wanted to turn around and sell this lens next year after having used it for a year, I probably wouldn't lose much money on it at all. these lenses really retain their value well. And my 400 millimeter 2.8 lens that I sold in order to get this lens, having used that lens extensively for about 8 years, I sold that lens for more than half of what I bought it for. That lens helped me get photos that I've sold over the years as limited edition prints. So that lens paid for itself. I could have essentially made a direct swap between my 400 2.8 version 2 and a version 2 600 millimeter, buying it used. And that was essentially what I was set on doing for a long time, until I had a client earlier this spring in my workshops, and they were renting the version 3 600 millimeter lens. And that client let me pick up the lens for a minute. And I just was blown away by how much lighter it was even than my 400 millimeter 2.8. This 600 is about 2 pounds lighter. This lens weighs around 6.8 pounds. That 400 2.8 was around 8.2 pounds. So it's a little bit less than 2 pounds, but you know, that's not an insignificant amount of weight when you're holding it out in front of you. But beyond that, what really makes this lens feel so much lighter is that Canon has more and more begun moving lens elements further to the back of their lenses as these new versions have come out. And so the version 3 lens has a lot more balance towards the rear of the lens, which is the same as this RF lens. And the reason that that's so important is when you're holding a big lens like this, if you have all of your weight out in front of you, it's going to pull this left arm down, and you're just going to be kind of constantly struggling to keep this lens steady and held up where you want it. But with this RF version and with the EF version 3, it's just so light feeling, and it's so much easier to handhold without getting fatigued. Now, briefly comparing this lens to the version 3 600, I ultimately decided not to go with the EF version for a couple reasons. First reason being that right now, a lot of people are selling their EF glass, and if I'm going to have a 600 millimeter lens, I intend to have this lens for, as I mentioned before, about 10 years. And I think probably 10 years from now, it might be harder and harder to sell an EF lens just because so many people are switching over to these mirrorless cameras. And I want this lens to be able to hold its value. The other thing with this RF version is it has an extra motor in it for autofocusing, and that doesn't actually impact anything when you're using the R5. But if you're using an R3 or most likely future, the R1, future camera bodies from Canon, it's going to be able to power that second motor. And so you're going to get just that much snappier autofocusing speed on this lens that you wouldn't get with the EF version. And then the last difference is that there's an extra half stop of image stabilization. So you get 5.5 stops of image stabilization with an RF body mounted to this RF version lens. Basically everything I've shot with this lens, I've shot handheld. I typically, when I'm doing video, I'm going to use a tripod, but just wanted to see how steady it was, and it's really usable and really remarkable. I handheld my 400 2.8 version 2. That lens was nowhere near as well balanced as this 600 is. And it doesn't have the same level of image stabilization as these new versions have. And so it was much more of a struggle to handhold. If handholding is something that you do a lot with your wildlife photography, which personally I recommend being handheld a lot because it allows you that flexibility to, change your perspective, get closer, farther away from your subject, change what your background is. I definitely recommend going with these newer versions. Now, quick shout out to Colin over at Pictureline in Salt Lake City, who hooked me up with this lens, and he got me all the accessories I needed and all that for it. He's super, super helpful, and he was able to get me a great deal on this lens. If you're interested in buying any camera gear in the coming months, weeks, years, whatever it is, definitely check out Pictureline. They've been incredibly helpful, and I can't recommend them enough. There's just a quality about photographing with these lenses that really sets your images apart from, images that are shot on a 100 to 500. And that's not to say that this is a bad lens. It just doesn't have the same sort of indescribable quality to it that kind of comes from that shallow depth of field of this bigger lens. This is so much more convenient than something like this, of course, even with all of the modifications that Canon has made to their 600 f4 over the years. This is still going to be a more convenient lens to use. I think if you're willing to put in the time and effort to get good shots with something like this, they're always just going to sort of give you that slight edge. Is it worth the extra probably $10,000 difference between these two lenses? It totally depends on what kind of subject you're photographing, whether you're making money from photography, and whether that really shallow depth of field and the ability to shoot at dawn and dusk is something that's important to you. If those things aren't important to you, then you're probably better off with something like this. And especially if you're learning photography, definitely start out with something like this. Fall in love with wildlife photography, get used to, getting out into the field a lot. Because, if you're carrying around a big lens, sometimes that can be a hindrance to you getting out into the field. So if the lens is going to stop you from going photographing, definitely don't go for a bigger prime lens. But if you're going to be out there photographing all the time, no matter what, and you want the best image quality possible, you definitely can't go wrong with something like this. Don't take my word for it. Go rent one of these things and feel how much lighter this is, especially if you've used another 600 before. I'm just getting much better images out of something like this, and especially something like this that is at 600 millimeters rather than with a teleconverter. I will use teleconverters again. I think I will, at times want to use teleconverters on this lens, but the more you can avoid teleconverters, I really urge photographers to try it out, see how the teleconverter looks. But, when you see how sharp the images are without the teleconverter and how fast the autofocus is, I can't recommend enough having your prime lens be the focal length that you're going to photograph most of the time. There really is just something kind of indescribable about the optics of these big lenses. I think that's something that everyone should have a chance to experience. So get out there, and I'll see you in the field. Before I sign off, I just want to give a quick plug for my photography expeditions that I do here in the Tetons in Yellowstone. I lead private tours year-round out here, and I will work with you one-on-one, teach you photography, show you where the wildlife is, and It's a great time. So if you're interested in that, go to pangeaexpeditions.org. That's PANGEA expeditions.org, and sign up for a workshop. I would love to see you out there. All right, bye-bye.